Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Marco Island Historical Society virtual Zoom presentation. This is our first presentation of the fall season, and we are so excited to have Magdalena Lamarre with us. She will welcome you personally, but before we begin, I'd like to give it a minute or two so that we can give folks a chance to come into the webinar. So we've got folks in with us now and some others are joining in. We'll wait just a moment. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. Let me introduce our speaker to you today. We are very, very pleased and privileged to have Magdalena Lamarre. Magdalena was a full professor of history and sociology at Miami-Dade College. Since her retirement in 2016, she conducts lectures on Florida's history, culture, diversity, and social justice. Lamarre earned a BA in history and secondary education from Hunter College, an MA in history education from Stony Brook University, and completed postgraduate work in both sociology and education at Florida International University. Magdalena's topic today, doomed expeditions, failed Spanish attempts to colonize Florida between 1513 and 1565. So please join us as we step into the perilous world of early Spanish explorers and their desperate quest to conquer La Florida. Welcome, Magdalena.
Thank you. Am I there yet? Yeah, I don't see myself. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're all set, Magdalena. You're ready to begin.
So it's not going to show me at all? Because I only see you.
I'm going to try changing the view on my side and see if that helps.
Okay. I mean, they like to see who the speaker is. If not, it's okay.
And are you there now, Magdalena?
I'm in front of you. I see you still.
Okay. All right. We'll go that way.
Okay. So we'll stay like that? Okay.
Yes.
All right. Well, first of all, there's a welcome here from the Florida Humanities. Please, at the end, there is a scan for you. And I'm sure that the Historical Society will remind you. It is very important that you evaluate, review this program. Even if it's bad, it's okay. I can make it better. But with today's situation of funding, we want to really get as much funding as we get for these kinds of educational programs. So please submit the form. It'll be at the end. You'll see a link, okay? Thank you so much for inviting me. This project is a new project on me. I'm very excited about this new program that I did. And I started to think, what can I do that's different in terms of Florida history? And the fact that a lot of Florida history during the Spanish period, is pretty much unknown or is incomplete. So I did this program. And I said, what's the best title? And my niece, who's my support, said, well, how about doomed expeditions? Because it sounds like, oh, wow, we have to listen to this. And as we go through the program, you're going to pretty much see that they were really doomed. One of the things that I do want to say, this is the period of colonization and conquest. And the program's purpose is not at all to evaluate or judge. It's just to provide the information of the consequences, events, and the whole overall picture of this period in history. Now, this particular map, I wanted you to look at it because I like to use maps. And this is La Florida. And you'll see how extensive, I mean, really extensive, you have here the territory that we know as Florida. And you'll see this coastline. Well, we're going to explain why. But look at this, all the way over to the Gulf of Mexico. So what Florida originally was, when Florida was originally identified and claimed by Spain, and then the explorations began, it was a very large territory. And it was even larger than this. When the Europeans started their exploration, Portugal went south around Africa and then went all the way to the east. So they got control of that area. Who gave it to them? The Pope. Meanwhile, Columbus sailed west, okay, and you know what happened with that trip? He encountered a whole new continent. So because of this competition between these two rival Catholic countries at this time, even though all of them were basically Catholic, they asked the Pope to help them, and the Pope divided the world. And this is called the Treaty of Tordesillas. Why do I show you this? Because basically from this division, you can see that all of this territory, if Spain had successfully been able to explore it, settle it, keep it, we would all be speaking Spanish, right? From Newfoundland down to Tierra del Fuego. We know that didn't happen, but this treaty divided the world. Of course, the countries of Europe did not like that. And in particular, the French king decided, okay, it doesn't come out. No. The French king said that he wanted to know why he couldn't get involved. Why did the Pope do this? And basically, this was his comment, that he wanted to see Adam's will that would deny him, another monarch, Catholic, right, of Europe, at this time, deny him access to it. So you can see here the amount of territory we're talking about. Now, what were the motivations? The Spanish conquest was these three concepts. Basically, this was it. God, because behind this whole project was, we will convert, we will spread the word of God. This was right after the age of reconquest of Spain by the Catholic monarchs. Catholicism was the dominant religion in Europe. You still haven't had the Protestant Reformation. So God was a very important motivator. Any area we went to, we have to bring the message of God, convert. And the conquistadors, a lot of them were actually kind of, when you see their actions, you wonder how they interpreted religion and God, but they were fervent believers in being people who were going to bring the word of God to the New World. Glory, all right? These were soldiers, these were adventurers. They wanted glory. They wanted recognition for Spain and for themselves. And of course, wealth. And why gold? Because gold was the standard in the world, right? This was the gold. This was the one metal, the one mineral, the one item that worldwide was recognized as having value. So these are the motivations. Of course, all right, when we explore these particular, when we explore them, we're going to see that in effect, they didn't get him. They failed, totally failed. They did acquire the gold, but in terms of the overall expeditions that we're talking about, they did not. All right, I can't get rid of this. I'm sorry. Getting rid of this. I can't get rid of the pointer. Excuse me a second. I'm trying to see if I can just get rid of. No. Okay, there it is. So when we think of the overall legacy, and notice I go to 61 because 1565 is St. Augustine, and that would be considered successful settlement. All of these expeditions, right? The one common element that they have is that they did not succeed. Every single one of them was a failed attempt. Some of them lasted a little longer, but the one element they all share was that they were a failure to attempt permanent settlements at that time. The longest one was only 2 years, and that was a pretty big feat for that period, but it also failed miserably. So now, what are the reasons? There were specific reasons for why this happened. One of the basic reasons was a lack of interest on the part of Spain in developing and attracting anybody to come to Florida. Once gold was discovered in the area of the Americas, like Mexico and then Peru, and no gold, and gold had been found in the Caribbean, but no gold was found in Florida, then there was no interest in even Spain's part in developing it. And what we have is a focus of Spain looking at this area and what to do with it, but very, very concerned about keeping control of it. So what we have here is that once they got rich, and I like to use quotes and for books here in case you're interested, once the Mexico and Yucatan, the wealth, and then Peru came out, that was it. This is what they wanted. And this was what they looked for in Florida. And this is going to be one of the reasons for the failure, because Florida does have gold and silver, but not, and they did have some developed civilizations, but nothing like what they found, for example, in Mexico. So when we look at the lack of interest, is that it didn't provide the wealth. It provided the missionary, but without wealth and without gold, there's no glory for Spain, and there was no glory for the conquistadors. Now you can see okay, this is the quote and this is the author. I like to give you ideas of readings and if you want to pursue the topics. Come on here. All right. Now, Spain, however, did realize that it was very important to hold on to this part of the world. And it's the reason was geography, a geographic location. Why? If you look at the map and the way it moves, right? And again, I just want to point to this little area. Notice that all the ships, even the ones coming from Asia, going into this area and coming from Mexico, Yucatan, Peru, they all leave from this region, right here, right outside St. Augustine, and they all leave for Spain with the Spanish gold galleons. So it becomes very important to protect this area, especially from pirates, but also protect it from the increasing intervention and incursions by the British, the French, the Dutch, and even the Portuguese. So this is why St. Florida is an area that they hold on to, even when they realize it doesn't fulfill their other goals because of this location. And it was a very important geographic location. And you'll see it was also a buffer. It protected the Spanish empire, right, from the British once they take over the eastern coast and take Georgia. That was the last frontier between Florida and the British. It was between Florida in the south and Georgia for the British, and later the United States in the north. Yeah, it's not working like I want. I'm sorry. What was another big problem? Lack of leadership. Now, they had leaders, but I call it qualified. These men were conquistadors. Some of them were soldiers. They were not explorers. They explored by accident. They were not even really military men. Some of them had fought in the wars of reconquest. Some of them may have had some experience, but really they were not trained military men. They were adventurers. They wanted gold and glory, right? So these individuals, even when they come with very large expeditions, and some of these expeditions had people in the thousands and included priests, artisans, it included people who could build, it included farmers, it included smiths. Even though they came with the personnel for a settlement, the conquistadors who led them, they wanted wealth, quick wealth. So you don't have a leadership that is really focusing on establishing a settlement and pushing for looking for gold. You're going to see how a lot of the defeat and the death that occurs in these particular expeditions was due to this focus of the conquistador, not to really settle, but to acquire wealth. And the loss of life was incredible. It was tremendous. We're going to see the worst, one of the worst ones. And we're going to see each different expeditions, and some of them will have all of these failures. Some of them will have maybe one. Shortage of labor. There was no interest. There was no gold. So they were not going to at all do any kind of development. And one of the reasons was also this lack of labor. The native population did start to decrease due to disease, and they're also going to decrease due to resistance. But also they needed the Spaniards who came here. They came to become hidalgos. They came here to be nobles. They came here to get wealthy and go back home. They may have married or taken African women or native women as wives, but what they wanted was to go home and marry a Spanish woman. This whole idea of the caste and the class system. So what do we have for laborers? Well, you need labor. We have the native population, which is in decline, and then it's protected by the queen. And then you have the introduction of Africans to do the labor, but then they must be purchased, and you're not supposed to spend the gold you make, and you must have permission because Spain did not have any direct access to the slave trade. So they would have to purchase the gold, using their gold from the Portuguese. And there was a control, they used to give them an asiento, a license. And it was not easy to get it, even when they got it. For example, Menendez in St. Augustine, he got a license for 500 enslaved Africans, and he barely brought in 50 or 60. This was never an area that attracted, so they were not going to spend money for enslaved persons from Africa because this was a heavy investment. So what we have then is a shortage of labor, and the Spanish population was not interested. Most of the people who ended up staying in Florida were military because Florida established St. Augustine, another fortress by Pensacola, and then St. Mark's in the south. So you have basically military garrisons. That's what it becomes with soldiers. And how they were supported was by the situado. They got a stipend from all that gold passing through. But with no other money coming in to the actual colony, there was no taxes to support a population there. So the shortage of labor. Now we're going to get to the two major reasons. People think that, the leadership would be maybe the location, the geography. The biggest detriment, the major problem with these two. Overall, the geography itself of Florida, the environment and aspects of nature, and the native population. They basically directly destroyed some, but definitely interfered with the development of others. And when we meet these two individuals, both of them are the first groups, right? Ponce de Leon and Luis Vasquez de Ayllón, who faced the first native resistance. And they also face nature. Now, again, another book, The Epic of Story of Spanish America, North America. Anyone who's interested, I will provide you with the reading list, okay? Let me go here. Now, this is like a perfect picture. When we talk about the natural environment as an obstacle, just the way that Florida, the swamps, the mangroves, the heat, the mosquitoes, and the fear that the Spanish encountered when they saw these, crocodiles and alligators. For them, these were monsters. And this is what they basically said. And they did not know the environment. Very often they were purposely taken, we'll see, by the native population into areas where they would encounter these monsters. So you have an environment that is not necessarily conducive to getting people to settle in it, because they have to compete with this kind of natural obstacles. So definitely when we think of the natural environment, just think of the way that the terrain is in Florida, the Everglades, the heat, the tropics, the rain, and not at all, familiar with it, because they came from Europe. They came from basically Northern Europe, right? They're coming from areas that fall within the temperate zones that are more like our territory in North America, not north of Florida, looking into the areas like New York, Connecticut, maybe Virginia. Nothing like Florida was in their original encounter in Europe, and now they're facing this environment that they were very much afraid of. Now, the actual greatest detriment, right, was just how it was described. This was a year or 2 years, basically 5 years, after St. Augustine was established. And this priest, look at how he describes Florida, okay? This was not an area that at all attracted people to even come and settle. Were there lands, areas that were great for agriculture and cattle raising? Yes. The whole area known as the Alachua, the area south of, between Georgia and the boundary of Florida, the territory that will become Seminole and Black Seminole territory around today, Ocala, Gainesville. This was an excellent area for agriculture and cattle raising. But this is not what the Europeans are going to first encounter, well, the Spaniards, when they come to Florida. They're going to come in through the south in the Keys, the shoals, the mangroves, the Everglades. You see the question of looking, not being exposed to the area that would be conducive to settlement. So with this kind of the advertising, you can see why even after 1565 until 1821, Florida was basically ignored and underdeveloped. What was the biggest drawback? Hurricanes in general. This is an excellent book. It talks about how hurricanes in general have, as you can see, have changed the course of history. And it talks about how greatly all of the colonies, even the northern colonies, how the British, the French, Portuguese, how they were all impacted, not just the Spanish, by hurricanes. And how they not only changed the course of history, they were a major factor in actually destroying even the beginning of the settlements. Excuse me. Florida was actually almost settled by and taken over by the French in Jacksonville area, Fort Caroline. This is one of the reasons that St. Augustine and Menendez comes to remove them. And basically what helped Menendez was that the French fleet was destroyed by a hurricane. If that hurricane had not destroyed that fleet, then maybe Menendez would not have been able to destroy that French incursion so easily, because the French came prepared, right? And of course, that was a doomed expedition, because even if they had succeeded in staying, this was a Protestant group in Spanish territory. So you have the other rivalries. But when we look at the Spanish settlements themselves, you can see that the greatest danger to Florida and to the gold, the galleons, right? Pirates were a problem, but they were not the number one problem. It's the weather, right? Something they couldn't control. So when we look at the history of North America, yes, hurricanes have played a major role in this. And then just the environment, they created a hazard when they came into the areas of the bays. If they weren't protected, this was something new. The first Europeans to encounter a hurricane were Columbus, right? Pretty much in his first and definitely his second voyage. I think he had like 17 ships destroyed in his second voyage. So what we have here is this being a significant negative aspect and negative impediment. But you'll also notice that just the reefs and the shoals on the eastern coast, right? These were also a major problem. So one of the things that historically has been documented is that more galleons were destroyed to hurricanes than by pirates, right? And on that shoreline, that's why you have, even today, you have all of the pirate still searching. Next one is native resistance. The native population we hear was destroyed basically through disease, through enslavement, through malnutrition, but not as much attention has been paid to the resistance. They fought, they resisted. And a lot of that resistance was in the reaction to how the Spanish engaged in tactics with them. But regardless of whether they won or not, they were a major obstacle. Now, when we look at how they, impacted and how they resisted, we're going to see that some of that resistance was very early forms of guerrilla warfare. And actually, it was in the Americas, I believe, that the Europeans learned about guerrilla warfare because they did not use standard military tactics that the Europeans were accustomed to when fighting any kind of battles. Again, the same author. When they came into this world, to the Americas, it was occupied. And some of these civilizations were pretty developed. And what we're going to have now is basically very often a brutal encounter, especially with some of the conquistadors. Okay, which were, there were a lot of native tribes. The ones that most of the conquistadors were going to meet encountered these groups, okay? The Calusa, the Tocobaga, the Timbuktua, and the Appalachian. And these were also the most warlike. And all of the, and the Guale were not. The Guale are going to be up here for another expedition, but they're going to play a role. But these in particular are going to be the major obstacle and destruction of the expeditions that we're going to look at. Yeah. Okay, let's look at, come on, I'm so sorry. All right, now I'm mentioning the Calusa here because this is what is going to be where Ponce de Leon is going to actually start. He'll first come this way and meet the Ayes people, who are a little bit more welcoming, and when they are the group that Menendez and St. Augustine mostly deal with, and they by this time have had other encounters because most of the early ships coming from Spain will come through here. But the Calusa were a very warrior group, and they will be very strong resistance, very strong, determined, and had probably the major impact for a number of the expeditions because they're taking off from Cuba and Hispaniola. And where are they going to go? They're going to go this way, right? Especially after Mexico, gold is discovered, because this is the route to that part of the world. Now, when they first, we have this contradiction of how they're described. When they first came to the Americas, Columbus describes them as being so humble and being so gentle. And, he takes some of them back because they tended to kidnap them. One of the reasons was to show what they had found, but also they would use them as translators. They would teach them Spanish and then bring them back to work as translators, interpreters, and also as guides. So he describes them this way, but he also talks about how it'll be so easy to subdue them and turn them into servants. They didn't call them slaves yet, into servants. So when we look at the second, by the time he goes to his second expedition, then, and when Ponce de Leon comes to Florida, all of a sudden they start to describe them as hostile, warlike, and savage. This is a very short period of time. So the impression that Columbus gave may have been just to initiate interest. But from the beginning, we're going to see, like I mentioned, Columbus's second expedition. Not only was it this, partially destroyed by a hurricane, but also native resistance. All right. So he encountered them, and now they're hostile, warlike, and savage, which was also used as an excuse to enslave them after the Queen of Spain started to protect them. So when we look at it, every one of the expeditions that we're going to look at were basically nearly destroyed because of native resistance. What kind of resistance? Okay, there's two kinds. Passive resistance. Okay, what did they do? Conquistadors would come in and they would capture them, right? Take a translator back, or enter a village and take someone as a guide. And that guide would then take them in a roundabout way, avoiding their village, or take them to an enemy village, right? So they didn't resist them directly because, of course, they encountered a superior army and weaponry, but they did find ways to use their environment and their skills as translators, interpreters, and as guides to lead the Spaniards on this merry chase into the swamps, into the mangroves, into areas or villages that had been emptied completely because they knew they were coming. So now the Spanish come in, no slaves, no food, no workers, no gold, right? So they engage in this kind of resistance. And then as part of this passive resistance is also direct warfare. These same individuals that would serve as guides because they were forced to by many of the conquistadors would take them into the areas of the Everglades and mangroves where the native population had an advantage in fighting. And they discovered soon that even with their heavy so-called armor, which was not really metal because only the wealthiest of the conquistadors could wear metal, but they did have like these heavy padded coats that they would wear, they would not take them off because they quickly discovered that the arrows and the spears that the native population could penetrate them. And if it didn't kill them, it definitely got their horses. And they caught them in these areas that would drown them. The heat resistance was terrible. Mosquitoes was another problem. So this was a way of using direct warfare by bringing them into an environment where they had an advantage. Now, all of these were doomed, all of these, and they all failed. And that's why I call them doomed. These are the five we're going to look at. Ponce de León, right? Vázquez de Ayllón, Panfilo de Narváez, Hernando de Soto, and Tristan de Luna y Arellano. I'd like you to think about which one of these you maybe were familiar with and which ones you were not. Because pretty much I believe everybody knows this person. And I think they know this person in Florida. I just wonder how many of you have heard of these. And let's see what happens to these individuals. 4 of these expeditions, 4 of them, okay? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 4, the leader died. Okay, so right there, doomed. And they brought with them thousands. Ponce de León may have had the smallest number, but he still had a heavy loss. Of the thousands who sailed to Florida, very few survived, right? One expedition we'll see, all right, basically had 4 survivors. And we'll see the original number. Let's go with Ponce de León. He made 2 trips. In the first trip, he goes along the coast to St. Augustine. He was actually looking for Bimini. He wasn't looking for Florida. He didn't even know Florida was there. He was not looking for the Fountain of Youth. There is no evidence in any of his writings or any of his meetings or requests to come to the New World and explore and be given this license because they had to have permission from the crown. There's no evidence. What they believe is that some of his competitors wanted to detract from him. They wanted to humiliate him. They wanted him to look like he was not an important enough individual to be given the right to explore and conquer these areas, especially since he's in direct competition with Diego Colón, Christopher Columbus' son, who was given control of Puerto Rico, and Ponce de León had been the governor of Puerto Rico, and he has to leave. He's forced to leave. So his expedition was looking for Bimini, all right? That's it. And of course, he didn't find the Fountain of Youth, and if he was looking for that, that would have definitely made it a doomed expedition. But he goes up on the north, that coast on the eastern seaboard. He comes back and he returns in 1521, but he goes to the west. And who does he encounter on the west? Remember the map of the Calusa? Okay, he's barely getting off the ship and he's attacked by the Calusa. The Calusa was one tribe probably that never was subjugated, never gave in to any of the missions and to the conversion. They basically did interact with the Spanish, but they were never really integrated into any of the system. They died out from disease, war, and just enslavement, because they did do campaigns of enslavement and take them to other islands and take them to South America, because again, it was cheaper for them to enslave this native population, right, than use gold to pay for African laborers. I'm sorry. Now, he will go from Puerto Rico, because he had to leave as governor. He'll do his first trip here, and then the second trip, you see where he goes. He goes around right here, and this is where he meets the Calusa. He did not realize Florida was a peninsula. He thought it was an island. And by his second trip, and this is another problem with the leadership, the Spanish government religiously and closely, secretly held onto all of its maps. They didn't want the Europeans to know any of these maps and what they had discovered. So these conquistadors, they didn't know who had come before. There was no sharing of information. They had to only use the maps provided by the Spanish, and very often they were not complete. So by 1519, there was a map that showed that Florida was a peninsula and that this whole coast, right, had been mapped out, the Gulf of Mexico, 1519. 1521, he still probably doesn't have an idea that this is a peninsula. And the sharing of information was another problem. Every conquistador that started at one of these explorations started like from the beginning, new information and incomplete. So he claims Florida in 1513. And if we want to think of the legacy, that's probably one of the major contributions to history, that he is able to claim this territory for Spain, because by this point, the British and the French and the Dutch are also moving up and down the eastern seaboard. So definitely his legacy was not the Fountain of Youth, right? Not the Fountain of Youth. He lands right off the coast, right? Is attacked by the Calusa. He's hit by an arrow. I think he loses about half of his men. They take him and go back to Hispaniola, and then they go to Puerto Rico, and he dies. That's the end of that expedition, right? He didn't find the Fountain of Youth, even though we know he wasn't looking for it. But he did claim, right, the North American continent is claimed with Florida. Was now a new territory that the Spanish can explore, and it establishes a claim. And one reason for doing the settlements is you have to also have settlers. You can't just claim the land; you have to develop it. So he started the claim. That's why he wanted to develop it. Now, what do we know about his manifest? And this is part of the historical legacy that we know about him. We have from his first and part of his second that he had one white slave, because not all slaves in Spain were Black. A lot of them were white. They might have been Black. They might have been from another European country. As part of his crew, we know that the first woman, a white woman, Juana Ruiz, a European woman, was part of his expedition, and she is noted as the first European woman to come to Tierra Firme, to the mainland. And another interesting factor is that his crew included persons of African ancestry. And this is very rarely documented. We know they were there. They're in the records, but they usually don't mention them. There was one individual that was widely mentioned because he had an interesting history. And his name was Black Conquistador because he was a conquistador. A lot of people don't know that, right? Was Juan Garrido. He came to Hispaniola and participated in the conquest of Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and he's on the expedition with Ponce de Leon. And we know this from Ponce de Leon's journals and writings, and also from Juan Garrido. Now, what's also significant about him is that it dispels another myth that we have. He was a free man. Many of the conquistadores that were Black that came to the Americas were not enslaved. Many were, and that's how they got their freedom. But many of the persons of African ancestry who first came to the New World in this period came as free persons. The pilot of Christopher Columbus's ship was a mulatto, Pedro Alonso Niño. His brothers owned I think it was a Pinta, the ship, one of his brothers. They participated as soldiers. They participated as settlers. And again, Some of them were enslaved, but many of them were free. He will go on to Cortés. So his history is a long one. And he participated in the conquest of Mexico. And we know about him because he's written in the journals of Ponce de Leon and Cortés, but also in some of the Spanish historians. And he asked for a pension from the king. So he wrote his own request. So we have his history. We don't have the history of a lot of these individuals because either if they were enslaved, it wasn't important to document them, but just the fact that they were Black. But also many of the white conquistadors, the young men that weren't well known or wealthy, we don't have all their names because they came there as adventurers and many of them did not survive. He's one of the survivors. The next individual is Lucas Vasquez de Ayllón. Now his expedition is in 26. His expedition is interesting because look at how much they had already mapped coast. And notice that here in this area, Virginia, Georgia, South Carolina, is the Tierra de Ayllón. And look who else. There's another one here, Gomez. So, and here's Garay. So this area on the coastline had been mapped. Now he comes in 1529, right? This is another doomed expedition. He had only 150 survivors of 700 colonists that left from, at that time, Hispaniola to the area. Now you're looking and saying, South Carolina, well, at this point, this is La Florida. This is all is La Florida. Now, an earlier expedition had captured a native, taken him to Spain, comes back, and he comes back as an interpreter, and he convinces the king of Spain, yes, this is a wealthy area, there's gold, oh, you have to, they're going to be, you're all going to be wealthy, I will be your interpreter. So Ayllón comes back with him, and they land right here. The landing was terrible, but why did that interpreter take them? Remember those passive resistance? He took them there because that's where he's from. And the minute he sets foot in South Carolina, in this area, which was the worst, was not a good place to establish, he runs away. So there they lose their guide and there they lose their interpreter. As a result, they move further down the coast, and this is where they actually established San Miguel de Guadalete. Now, of this expedition, you can see only 150 survived. He did not. They got sick. Their ships here on the coast were destroyed because they didn't know the coastline. They didn't have enough food. They started working well with the Guale Indians, but I guess they got aggressive, forcing them to give food. And of course, this causes the Indians to rebel. The colonists start to rebel, and there's a mutiny because they're sick and there's no food. And they actually try to take over the colony. For some reason, the enslaved Africans and the native population joined together and they set fire to parts of the colony. And then they disappear. So when the survivors, only 150 or 700 colonists, returned to Santo Domingo, the Dominican Republic today, Haiti today, Hispaniola, the enslaved persons were not part of it. We have no clue what happened to them. It is believed that they are part of what's called the first Underground Railroad, because Florida becomes the Underground Railroad. Everything south of the northern border of Florida, the whole territory of Florida, becomes the first Underground Railroad in US history and in Spanish history. And this is the first time that we have a documented group that may have been part of the railroad because they escaped and they used the environment. They also joined with the native population. And we know that they say they believe that they escaped and they would have joined the Guale, which was very common for the African population who escaped to join with the native population. Now, Panfilo de Narvaez, his was the worst expedition. It's like almost everybody died. 4 survivors. And from the beginning, he has every problem. He's a horrible leader. His first major problem as a leader, he is sent by the governor of Hispaniola to Cuba to bring back Cortés with troops, and Cortés basically captures him, captures all his men, co-opts them, and he's basically in prison, right? That's it. So he fails in capturing Cortés and fails in participating in that great conquest. So now he gets a second chance, right? Well, that was his first thing, right? Bad leader. And you'll see his leadership is bad here too. What he starts to do quickly here, you'll see is he takes and he, right, puts his ships sends for supplies in the area of Trinidad, Cuba, and he's hit by a hurricane, right? 2 ships, 60 men get lost. Now, he started off with 600 men that he came with like 1,200 men from Spain, but he only has 600 men that leave in the expedition. So just coming from Europe to the Dominican Republic, he loses half of his people. Now he loses here the ships and supplies. Okay, he stays there too long, right? And he launches it with only five ships now and 80 horses. Okay, by the time they get to the area of Tampa Bay, the horses are gone. Okay, this is a problem because this is what they need to move through the terrain. And for some reason, he decides to disembark by land, not having a clue what's here, and sending the ships away with the supplies to a bay that he had no clue where it is. They march looking for it, and what happens next? Okay, and no food and harassment by the native population. And who does he meet? Again, the Apalachee, very warlike and warrior group. He also meets the Aute here, and this basically ends up with him having to leave. So you see how quickly his expedition deteriorates. So here he's at this shore in the Bay of Horses, and this is because they ended up killing their horses, eating them, and making these little boats, basically like floating rafts, to leave in the Gulf here, have no idea where they're going because they don't have maps. He leaves with 255 men, 51 men, and what does he face? A storm in the Gulf of in the Gulf. And what happens? He dies, and the expedition, right, starts to lose individuals, right? So what he does is by the following year, you know, he has by the following. I'm sorry, I'm trying to get this to go. You know, after he faces the loss of his ship and the constant attacks, because that was another problem, right? Harassing the native population, they harass him back. He goes into the Gulf in these flimsy boats, and he dies. And so does he also, they're lost at sea, 80 to 90 men. Okay, right there, he loses half of his people. 1 year later, there were only 15 survivors. Okay, and pretty much about a year after that, 4 survivors. Of the estimated 300, 4 reach Mexico City. It takes them 8 years walking across. Now, when we look at this expedition, this one was doomed in many ways because of all of the negative factors we addressed. Now, historically, one of the survivors was this young man, Esteban Lamarre. There were 3 Spaniards, his master, de Dorantes, and he's called Esteban de Dorantes. Now, what we know about these 4 men is that they did explore this whole area. He was enslaved. He wasn't enslaved, but he was an explorer. And what they did was, look, eventually, this is where we lose the Navarrese and most of the people. They start a trek, right? They get here to Galveston by water, and here they walk 8 years to finally reach Mexico City. He will go back, and he will lead, Esteban will lead an expedition to Arizona. He will reach Arizona a year before Coronado. But of course, Francisco de Coronado is the person who is designated as the founder of the Cibola and the explorer founder of Arizona. Now, what is the legacy? Only 4 survived, but they're going through this territory and mapping it. They were actually the first people to cross the Mississippi, right, by water, if you think of it, along the coast, and to pass through this area. So this was an expedition that documented, and Vasco de Gama, I'm sorry, Cabeza de Vaca, he wrote a book which documented this whole experience. You can read it in English. And in those 8 years, they survived by the leadership of Esteban, who basically was very good with speaking, picking up languages. He was their guide, and he had very good interaction with the native population, and he knew how to use herbs, and they were seen as healers. So they basically credit, he's mentioned, he's one of the few persons of African ancestry mentioned in the document as playing a major role in this kind of expedition. They were the first people to see the Mississippi. Okay, so the Soto, you're going to hear he's a discoverer, but they were really the first people. They crossed the Gulf of Mexico into Texas. They're the first Europeans to cross Texas. By doing this, they claimed Texas also for Mexico because Cortés goes straight to Mexico. He doesn't go to Texas. And they basically explored that whole southeastern region going to the west of the United States, the future United States. This is an example of mapping for the area. Hernando de Soto, okay, now what about him? He cut a path of destruction. His would have been the most brutal and the most destructive of all of the expeditions. His expedition, after 4 months, ended with him dying and about half of the 12 to 1,500 persons that were part of his expedition. Now, his expedition also was basically looking for gold. Even though he had all of these settlers, he just was looking for gold, looking for gold. And he's an example of someone that was led on a merry trail, because he would capture individuals, he would ask for who was a chief, he would be given someone. Very often they would discover that they were taking them in the wrong direction, or they were taking them to enemy territory, that there was no food in the villages, and they would kill the guide. So these kind of actions, a lot of encounters, a lot of fighting. The native population did not survive, but they resisted. So this is an example of really aggressive native resistance, leading to their death. But it shows that this was a dynamic going on here that led to more than just disease, to the killing of the native population, but also shows that this coming in by these explorers was not welcome. They were not easily able to come in and take this territory. But they did document them. We have the names of many, many tribes, and he actually encountered the mound builders, the agricultural mound builders. This is the first mention of them, by making this trip. You can see his trip was constant, looking for gold. And that was his problem everywhere. Where's the gold? Where's the gold? Until he finally reaches the Mississippi, where he dies. He got sick. The expedition is finished by one of his men. But this was an example of basically just aggressive, looking for the gold and focusing only on that, and the constant fighting, and these settlers. He's dragging with him these people who are supposed to be settlers. They're not really soldiers, and even the soldiers were not really trained soldiers. So the Soto expedition was probably leadership to a certain degree. He was not a settler, an explorer. He was not there to really develop a settlement. He was there to find gold. Now, what was the outcome of this destruction? Everywhere he encountered, he attacked for food or enslaved, because he only carried pigs. He carried no food. So right there, you can see a problem with his logistics. Of the original 700, okay, 311 survived, right? 311. He was not one of the survivors, and he didn't find gold. What we do know about him and his legacy, that even though it's considered a failure, that probably the most comprehensive mapping of this territory was done as a result of his expedition, and the identification of between him and Cabeza de Vaca and the previous expedition had the most historical recording of tribes that basically disappeared because of fighting and disease. Now, what we have today is a lot of indigenous populations, information on and names that were gone within maybe 50 to 100 years. Last expedition, Pensacola, Tristan Luna de Arellano. He was a bad leader, and he had misfortunes. Unfortunately, leadership and the misfortunes destroyed it quickly. What's significant about him was that this was a 2-year settlement. Now, he leaves from Mexico, and as a result, he included Aztecs in his expedition. So he did have some experienced soldiers. He had 1,500 soldiers and colonists and enslaved Africans that were part of the expedition. He establishes the colony in Pensacola. Now, when he lands there, he decides that he wants to explore, and he leaves the ships and the supplies where he enters the bay in Pensacola, right? Did not empty the ships, did not prepare the settlement. And he gets hit by a massive hurricane that destroys pretty much, I think he had like 5 ships. 3 of them have been found, all of the supplies, any of the equipment for developing the settlement. And this is probably the worst example of nature destroying from the beginning of settlement. Now his colony has been found finally. They've been looking for these original colonies or attempted settlements, and his settlement, it was a 2-year settlement, has been found by the University of Florida on the West Coast in Pensacola. And the legacy basically for him is they do have the settlement. They have found 3 ships. And it was the longest in terms of establishing a colony in the Americas. This was the oldest established multi-year settlement. It lasted 2 years, but that's multi-year. Why is it significant? This is a few years before St. Augustine, right? And almost about 80 years before Jamestown. So we had the first multi-settlement in Florida established by this group in Pensacola. As you can see that each of them had one aspect of the different problems, right? The obstacles. We could see that some of them had all of them. But when we look at the history of these expeditions, we can see that there was to some degree a lack of preparation. There was a lack of preparation. There was also more hostility with the native population that we hear about. And we really can see the role that nature can play on impeding development and advancement, in this case, settlement of Florida at this time. So here we have it, 6 years before St. Augustine and 48 before Jamestown. Colony is established. 2 years. Thank you very much. We have time for questions, right? Because, yeah, okay, good. We have time for questions. This is my contact information. If you just take a picture of that little thing there, the QR, you can see programs that I do, but you can also contact me if you want a reading list, because I do provide reading lists, okay? And that's what I looked like because I wasn't on the screen. And please, thank you so much for participating. Please thank the Florida Humanities and thank the Historical Society of Marco Island for presenting this, and give them an opportunity to do future programs. You can, again, just take and scan this QR code and do an evaluation. I'm sure that the program hosts have told you that. But this is an
and
opportunity.
Magdalena, actually, we follow up, I think, with a survey as well.
But this is good too. They can take a picture and because sometimes you forget, you do it in the moment, it's good.
So thank you so very much. I did want to see if there were any questions that people would like to ask. They can just put them in the Q&A or in the chat. Magdalena and I are looking at both of those. If there's something in particular, I actually just had one question, Magdalena, if I could.
I see the chat.
Of the 5 expeditions that we explored with you, do you have a thought as to which one was the most impactful?
De Soto.
Hernando
De Soto. The most destructive, because every tribe, every member, every area that he encountered was destruction. He negatively impacted them by fighting, by stealing for them, by enslaving them, by destroying communities, by destroying, fighting. It was also the most impactful because the destruction of these populations, unfortunately, after disease was introduced, was going to lead to their demise. That we know. The introduction of measles and smallpox, etc. These diseases are one of the major factors. They're not the only one. They always emphasize the destruction of disease and maybe the malnutrition, but we could see that, that fighting, resistance was a major. But because of the disease, they were going to be negatively impacted. That was a given. So we would have lost all of this information. And he did travel through this area and document areas before they were lost. It wasn't his goal or his intent, but that nevertheless did happen because of the people. He had priests, he had scholars, he had writers, he had caulkers, he had artisans, he had people that were qualified to establish a settlement. Unfortunately, they didn't because of his agenda. But they did document this whole area, so we know, probably from him and Cabeza de Vaca, the 8 years that they went through the United States, we have the most complete historical record of the names of so many tribes that were lost to history, and also identification of many areas also that left, and that he visually saw the mound civilizations, the mound builders that were advanced agriculture. He did find advanced agricultural societies. He just didn't see the goal that's what he wanted and didn't, so that was the problem. They didn't have the goal, but that doesn't mean that there weren't advanced civilizations in that area, and that was documented. So I think that on every level, the most negative, but the most positive in a way of history, De Soto would be a significant individual. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Well,
Mhm.
I don't see any questions, so I do want to say good
Did
afternoon.
anybody, let me ask him, did anybody learn something new that you want to share? Was there any new information that came up?
Anything anyone would like to share?
Something new you learned, something you didn't know about at all?
Well, I learned a tremendous amount.
Well, I'm sure when they do the report, they'll do that too. Thank you
Well,
so
thank you
much.
again, Magdalena, and our thanks to the Florida Humanities. They are such a wonderful, wonderful organization who does so much to preserve and share the culture and the history of Florida through speakers like Magdalena. So we're very grateful, and look for us again, because we will be back to you with 2 more virtual programs this fall.
Thank you
Thank you,
for
everybody.
inviting
Have
me.
a good afternoon.
Thank you for inviting me. It's always a pleasure. It gives me an opportunity to share my research and to help me to continue to teach, even if I'm retired.
Thank you,
Take
Magdalena.
care.
Bye.
Bye.